Hello and welcome. My name is Shanna Kissling-Shepherd, and for this presentation, I will be discussing patriarchal origins of gender-based violence. This compendium fulfills requirements for the Masters in Social Justice and Human Rights program at Arizona State University. The primary focus of this presentation will look at church patriarchy and how it lends toward various forms of gender-based violence, along with suggestions for a better path forward. To introduce myself, I am passionate both personally and professionally to eradicating gender-based violence through forms of education and advocacy. I am a survivor of intimate partner violence and also a member of the Christian church. I was lucky enough to be surrounded by a loving church community both during and at the point of exit from an abusive marriage. This experience, however, opened my eyes to the plight of others, both in and outside of the church, who lack the same benefit of communal support. Professionally, my work with several Seattle-based nonprofits focuses on equipping and empowering survivors of gender-based violence to live lives undefined by their circumstances. I have also partnered with local churches to offer training and curriculum so they can better serve members of the community experiencing gender-based violence. As a warning, this compendium contains themes of gender-based violence, church abuse, sexual assault, racism, sexism, and other upsetting topics. Please practice self-care as you view this presentation and take breaks where they are needed. In this presentation, we will cover the overarching theme of church patriarchy, along with its lending toward various forms of gender-based violence. Specifically, this compendium focuses on intimate partner violence and its prevalence within the Christian church, along with the church's response to such occurrences. We will also look at other forms of violence against women, including sex trafficking and femicide. Vulnerability factors for these forms of violence will also be examined. We will then look at a few organizations currently paving the way in the fight toward gender equality, placing a spotlight on one particular organization, Seroptimus International. Lastly, I will offer suggestions for a path forward. Since this compendium is aimed at the church's response toward gender-based violence, I will give tangible suggestions for ways the church can partner with victims and survivors in the future. The Christian church is rooted in the patriarchal belief that men are superior to women. While the Bible does not lend to this, it does assign specific gender roles to male and female sexes. In modern Christianity, this looks like a form of benevolent patriarchy known as complementarianism. This says that the husband has authority over the wife and children, only men can be church leaders, and that women must submit unilaterally to men, fathers, husbands, and pastors. While not meant to be a form of oppression, and as this originated with men being encouraged to lead sacrificially, it still does lend toward a power differential that often results in abuse. Because of this, intimate partner violence and other forms of violence flourish in the church and is also mishandled because of this. The origins of church patriarchy come from the first couple, Adam and Eve. In the Bible, Eve is made from Adam's rib. There is never a point where Eve was thought to be inferior to Adam, but instead a helper. The Bible was very specific on gender roles, but did not ascribe to a view that one sex was more important than the other. This has been manipulated and abused in the church for centuries on end. My hope is that healing and education can abound within the church to truly examine what this form of complementarianism should look like instead of abusing it, which is currently found in many churches. What is intimate partner violence? This is a form of domestic violence by a current or former spouse or partner against the other spouse or partner within the relationship. So this looks like abuse within a marriage or even a dating relationship or long-term domestic partnership. There are 4 types of IPV, and they are physical violence, sexual violence, stalking, and psychological aggression, or also known as emotional abuse. As we look at the church and the response to victims of IPV, we find that they have not measured up to the core belief that value is assigned to all human life and that benevolent assistance should be provided to all humans. The church is based on a premise of Christ-like love, and more often than not, we sadly find this lacking in its response to gender-based violence. We see the church's emphasis on marriage, and while the loyalty to marriage is good and noble and true, we often find that loyalty to a relational structure allows evil, such as violence, to continue. And this makes it a false loyalty. Many men within Christianity use their wives, their spouses' sense of Christian guilt and the Christian teaching about the sanctity of marriage as a weapon to keep harming them. This harbors the feeling that if more women started saying, "This is over," and were speaking up and backed by a church that enabled them to escape instead of enabling the abuse to continue, other men in the church who are tempted toward the same behavior may wake up and change their ways and their patterns of abuse. We also find in harboring this pattern of abuse that Christians are more likely to have one-income families. This makes many Christian wives feel more vulnerable. If they are not able to provide for themselves or for their children, they lack a voice. They lack the empowerment of saying enough is enough because of that fear that only the man can provide for them. In terms of complementarianism and its role, we do know that women make up more than half of the church, and they most likely do the bulk of the mission, ministry, prayer, worship, and discipleship within the life of the church. So we have to ask the question, why aren't women serving in leadership positions? From beginning to end, the Bible positions women as leaders in ways that were actually groundbreaking at the time in which the Bible was written. Women directed armies, they defeated prominent enemies, and they saved communities from genocide. A woman gave birth to God, funded Jesus' ministry, and sat at the feet of the disciples. And they are the first witnesses and preachers of the resurrection. They are church founders and leaders, prophets, and apostles. Women are co-laborers with God and men, and image bearers of God who are meant to participate in God's work both in the church and around the world. However, in patriarchal churches, women are interpreted into relevance in the scripture. For example, if a woman is presented as a leader in the Bible, then surely it's due to the failure of men who aren't stepping up to their God-given right to lead. God had no choice, and it was a last resort. This false pattern of thinking and false way of interpreting the Bible is one example of how the church fosters such patterns of abuse. One additional form of violence against women that we are focusing on is sex trafficking. Early childhood abuse and or intimate partner violence often contributes to the likelihood of victimization within the sex industry. We also know that homelessness, substance abuse, and intimate partner coercion are primary risk factors for such victimization. Sex trafficking includes, but is not limited to, escort services, pornography, illicit massage and beauty parlors, prostitution, and strip clubs. We also know that the prevalence of women and girls as trafficking victims alludes to patriarchal influences on victim versus perpetrator. If we look at labor trafficking versus sex trafficking, we find that labor trafficking is primarily dealt with men and boys, whereas sex trafficking is primarily women and girls. This alludes to the importance placed on a woman's body versus their ability to do physical labor. We also have seen that sex work is not outside the realm of sex trafficking, and it does not empower women. The belief of the Christian church is that no one chooses the profession of sex work. There is always an underlying reason for entering this profession. While it is known as the world's oldest profession, it is not seen as something to be chosen by someone who has lived a life without trauma. Forms of childhood trauma or adult trauma are often factors for a woman's choice to enter the profession of sex work. Another form of violence against women that is not too often discussed is femicide. This is defined as the intentional killing of women or girls, most often by males, for the simple fact that they are female. This is an example of necropolitics, which is a sovereignty's power to assign value to a human life. In many third world or developing nations, we see this happening, particularly in the ability of cartels to utilize women as pawns by developing a society in which they are killing women and girls. They accomplish a purpose of crippling the society and taking over, therefore furthering their mission. This underhandedly proves the necessity of women for a society to thrive, however, because the sovereignty believes that femicide shows total dominion and not that this can be accomplished by the extermination of males. This flies in the face of what they originally believed. So even the evilest of folks, such as cartels, anyone looking to cripple a society, they understand that by doing so, you must wipe out the ability to produce life and the ability to produce nurturing. Societies cannot survive without women to carry forth new life. They cannot thrive without women to serve as nurturers. Men do not have the natural capabilities to do either of these things. So with this, it seems such sovereign powers have more regard for female capabilities than their actions would originally lead us to believe. And they do, in fact, know what they're doing in trying to cripple a society by performing femicide. Such acts as these that occur in many developing nations show an ignorance of sorts on the part of the American people, and there arises a need for transnational advocacy to expand the framework of human rights from a feminist perspective. As Americans, it's very easy to get caught up with the woke trend of the day. Many of these trends and social causes are so important, but we must step outside of our privilege and think globally. Or if we feel that thinking globally is too much of a leap, we at least can think outside of our culture. An example of this is the current plight of Indigenous women throughout the U.S., particularly in northern states. 4 out of 5 Native American and Native Alaskan women have experienced violence, with half of that experiencing sexual assault. Native American women experience violence at a rate of 10 times higher than non-Native women, according to the Indian Law Resource Center. Yet those with much lighter skin tones are the ones that receive the national press when the same plight occurs to them. American media has failed these women. Americans as a whole have failed these women. Thinking globally is not such a stretch when it comes to this. Using an us them society when it comes to native populations, we're taking away platforms. Christian nationalism also lends to an inability to think globally or even cross-culturally. Images of a white, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus conjure up thoughts that all Christians should look the same. This dangerous way of thinking led to the Crusades, the Holocaust, Native American forced boarding, and a slew of other atrocities in the name of the church. All of this began in the name of male headship. Church patriarchy has initiated these forms of violence, and church patriarchy must be ended and accounted for if these forms of violence are going to cease. Many NGOs exist to empower women and girls. A few are leading the way, such as Seroptimist International, the Malala Fund, Girls Inc., UN Women, Strong Girls, and so many more. Seroptimist International is a pioneer in leading the way towards empowerment of women and girls. And according to their mission statement, women and girls will achieve their individual and collective potential, realize aspirations, and have an equal voice in creating strong, peaceful communities worldwide. Seroptimists transform the lives and status of women and girls through education, empowerment, and enabling opportunities. Seroptimist International urges governments to ratify and implement any treaties affecting the area of human rights, specifically pertaining to women and children. They also advocate for the criminalization and prosecution of those in violation of these rights. They are a participant for justice advocacy as a non-governmental organization. Such organizations have been responsible for updated human rights policies at the UN. Additionally, they partner with international government organizations to enact change throughout the world. Where state governments were typically responsible for education and advocacy, NGOs such as Seroptimist International have picked up the slack in providing such support, especially in the area of gender-based equality. While Seroptimist International is not a church-based NGO, many churches partner with the organization in their efforts to empower women and girls. How do we forge a path forward, particularly within the church's response to gender-based violence? This comes if a focus is placed on mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual health of victims. Outside experts must be brought in to conduct trainings. Church leaders should be trained and equipped to address gender inequality and domestic violence. An example of this happened when the World Health Organization gathered data from mental health experts to equip humanitarian workers in cases where gender-based violence was present. While the report was intended for use by nonprofit organizations in relief work, the expertise offered would provide great training for faith leaders presented with cases of IPV and other gender-based violence within their congregations. A path forward also depends on data collected from victims, experts, church leaders, and perpetrators. These combined perspectives provide a possible framework for guiding victims through the trauma of abuse. Pointing out the similarities between church leadership and patriarchal systems will drive home the idea that change begins deep within each denomination and congregation. Churches should also establish programs to empower women in the community. If they do not have the ability to establish such programs, partnerships must be formed with programs in the area, such as the ones described in the previous slide. The church must recognize that it plays a key leadership role. Their response to violence against women has the potential to change the world, and their admittance of the patriarchal systems that allow such violence to thrive is the key linchpin in marking lasting change.